These are, I don't always get sent to the places that I exactly want to see. So,
well, from what I've seen, Eddie, you've been doing an awful lot of traveling lately.
I have been traveling quite a bit. Have a few months off. January, I'm supposed to have a new baby, so they're letting me hang out at home with the baby for a while.
Oh, congratulations.
So, thank you.
They know what causes
I don't know why I'm dropping
that now, by the way.
Yeah, well.
They didn't for a long time, but now they do.
Okay, looks like it's starting to let everybody in. The number's climbing. Very cool. We have over 1,000 people registered for this, so we'll see how many actually are here. It's always great to see all the different names from all around the world. And I know, Mike, yours are some of the highest attended webinars, so we're always thankful to have you on the platform. We'll give it just a little bit longer to make sure we get all of the people in. Welcome, Lior from Israel, Oregon, Berlin. All right, we're about a minute, so let's go ahead and get started. Hello, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for joining. We are going to, like I said, let folks trickle in for just a few more seconds. But in the meantime, go ahead and pop a message into the chat. Several of you have let us know where you're from. Please continue to do that. I love to see that. But I want to welcome you to today's webinar, Predetermined Change Control Plans, or PCCPs, approving medical device changes before you make them. My name is Etienne Nichols. I'll be the moderator for today's session. I'm the head of thought leadership and industry insights at Greenlight Guru. Our mission is to improve the quality of life through our work in the medtech industry, likely a shared goal of many of you who are here today. We host these free webinars to share valuable insights, learn from top industry experts, and to showcase our industry-leading solutions. Mike, if you don't mind, just go ahead and show the next slide, if you don't mind. Our software is designed to help medtech companies bring life-changing products to patients faster, more efficiently, and with less risk. Our medtech suite includes software solutions for product development, quality management, and clinical data management. They're all tailored specifically for the medical device industry. So if you're interested in learning why over 1,000 leading medtech companies trust Greenlight Guru, feel free to visit www.greenlight.guru for your personalized demo after today's webinar. So just to check to see how many of you were paying attention, I'd like to run a quick poll. How do you currently manage your medical device documentation and quality processes? So if you're able to go to the polls tab up in the top right, you see the chat and the poll. Love to see how you are managing your medical devices. Let's see. Looks like we have, most are using general purpose document management systems, some paper-based. It's great. We'll just leave it open for just a few more seconds as you answer those. Okay. Very cool. So just thank you for indulging me for that. Just a few housekeeping items before we dive into the presentation. First, we want to invite you to actively participate. Please use that chat tab at the right, the top right. You should be able to see that. That's the way to connect to fellow attendees. Let us know where you're from. Let us know all of your thoughts on the presentation so far. You can also use the Q&A tab on the top right, and that is where you can ask questions that you specifically want us to ask Mike at the end during the Q&A session. So even if you don't have a specific question you want to ask, feel free to navigate to that Q&A section, because you can upvote or thumbs up questions, and we'll try to address the ones that are most relevant to the audience. And so we can only know that if you go over and indicate that that way. Second, we will be sending out the full recording and a handout later to all the registrants after the live event. So keep an eye on your inbox and watch for that follow-up email. Now to introduce today's expert presenter, Michael Drews is the president of Vascular Sciences, a consulting and training company offering a broad range of services to medical device, pharmaceutical, and biotechnology companies, including creative regulatory strategy and competitive regulatory intelligence, regulatory submission design, and FDA presentation, preparation, and defense. Dr. Drews is an internationally recognized expert who brings a breadth of knowledge and hands-on experience in his teachings from the ongoing work he does for FDA, Health Canada, and other regulatory and governmental agencies around the world. He's also a featured keynote speaker on cutting-edge medical technologies and regulatory affairs. And if you are familiar with the Global Medical Device podcast, you'll recognize his voice right away, as he's a longtime frequent guest on the show. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to you, Mike, for today's feature presentation.
Thank you, Eddie. for that very kind introduction. I just want to reconfirm that you're able to see my screen as well as hear my voice.
Yes, it is breaking up just a little bit. I'll turn my video off and maybe we'll go off camera because but yeah, go ahead. I can see the screen.
Okay. Okay, we'll do the best we can. If it becomes a significant problem, let me know. So once again, I want to thank you, Edian, for that very kind introduction. I want to thank all of my many friends at Greenlight Guru for the opportunity to host this particular webinar today, both to you that are listening live right now, as well as to the folks that might be listening to the recording in the future. This presentation is on the Predetermined Change Control Plan, or PCCP.
Hey,
and
Mike, I think we probably should go ahead and see if we can fix the audio with the video off. We are getting a lot of feedback from the audience about that. Yeah.
All right, let me turn off my camera. Okay. So I believe my camera is off.
Yes, much
and
better.
You can still see my screen. Much better. Excellent.
Yep.
All right. Well, let me just start again then. Apologies for the technical problems. The technology is wonderful when it works. Anyway, as I said a moment ago, I want to thank my many friends at Greenlight Guru for the opportunity to conduct this webinar today on the Predetermined Change Control Plan, or PCCP. Just a couple of things I wanted to add to the introduction that Edian was kind enough to share with you a moment ago. I consult for a wide variety of not just medical device companies, but I also work as a consultant for the FDA, as well as Health Canada and some of the other regulatory agencies around the world. And the reason why I mention that is because, quite frankly, there's not a lot of people that can say that work on both sides of that proverbial fence. So I really try to use that to my advantage. In addition, I just wanted to reiterate that not only do I do a lot of podcasts and webinars with Greenlight, I also am a contributing editor to several of the other large regulatory and medical technology publications, and you can see the links to where some of my materials can be found on the screen. This slide and most of the slides that you see today are in the handout, and the hyperlinks should be active in the PDF handout. So if you just click on where it says here, that should take you to these things.
Mike,
just a couple of other real quick things. Yep.
I apologize for interrupting. It's still very bad. We're getting a lot of comments in the chat about people not able to understand due to the audio. Would you mind going ahead and logging out and logging back in and just see if that does anything?
Okay, I will try. Hold on just 1 second. Let me.
Thank you for your patience, and I know this is.
Let's see.
Probably here. Just close that and then open it again with the link.
Okay, I will try that. Keep your fingers.
Thanks for your patience, everybody. If you're able to stick around for just a minute, this is not happened before that I can remember. Mike's one of the best presenters, so it's definitely worth hanging around if you are able to. In the meantime, if you have not heard his audio or his podcast on PCCPs, we did one of those a few weeks ago. So we'll get some links too as well. So you definitely can still get this information if we're not able to complete it today. But in the meantime, I am curious. We have a few polls, so I'm going to prep you for our polls that are coming up. One of the questions that we're going to be asking is, have you performed a PCCP? So I'm curious if anybody has. If you feel free in the chat if you'd like. I'd love to hear. I'm going to go backstage just to see if anybody, if I'm able to help as well. So just hang tight for just a minute, and we'll be right back. Okay, Mike is backstage. It looks they're working on his audio. Sounds like it could be better. So, okay, I'm looking at the chat here. Most people have not used it. If anyone has, I've missed it so far. So this is interesting. Okay. halfway through our PCC process. Okay, very interesting, Marion. I'd be curious too if there are any devices that are not AI ML. Of course, I don't think we have a big enough pool to ask that question just yet, but another question I might ask is this your first Greenlight Guru event? How many of you have been here, have been to one of our Greenlight Guru events, whether it's in person or online, virtual? And I have a follow-up question. If you have been to one, what's been your favorite so far? All right, great, Savannah. I love the hand raising. Awesome. Oh, Gretchen, you've been to one of the in-person events. Very cool. Hey, Mike.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought I was already on stage. Okay, so
Share your screen. People are sharing what their favorite webinar, favorite event has been so far in the chat. So I'll buy you a little bit of time here.
all right, we're going to try this one more time. Everybody keep their fingers crossed. So let's see here. Are you able to see my screen?
Yes.
And are you able to hear me, hopefully better?
Audio sounds good. Yep.
All right. So shall we continue on?
Yeah. Take it away.
All right. So just backing up to the beginning, I want to thank Greenlight Guru for the opportunity to conduct this webinar today. It's one of dozens and dozens of webinars that I've done over the years with Greenlight, and some 150 podcasts, as Edian mentioned a moment ago. One thing that I did want to just add to the introduction that Edian shared is, in addition to consulting for a wide variety of medical device companies, I also work as a consultant for the FDA, as well as Health Canada and a few of the other regulatory agencies around the world. And the reason why I mention that, quite frankly, is because there's not a lot of people that can say that work on both sides of that proverbial fence. And so I really try to use that to my advantage. And then the other thing that I want to mention about me is, in addition to doing a lot of work with Greenlight, I'm also a contributing editor to several other regulatory and medical technology publications. I'm constantly putting out a lot of podcasts and webinars and columns on a variety of different topics. You can see some of the organizations that I work with on the screen right now. This slide, as well as most of the slides that you see today, are going to be in the PDF handout that you'll receive after the webinar, and the hyperlinks should be active in that PDF handout. So you can just click on any of the hyperlinks, and it should take you where you want to go. I'm also proud to say that this past year I was named one of the top 24 MedTech voices to follow in 2024. For those of you that are familiar with that list from MDDI magazine, Edian is also on that list as well. So we share that in common. And two of the webinars that I've done, two of the podcasts that I did last year with Greenlight were the #1 and #2 most listened to podcasts, one on AI in medical devices and the other with potential issues with the 510K. And finally, my webinar that I did last year on complaint handling was the #10 most listened to webinar in the Greenlight universe. So just wanted to share, little accolades. It's always nice to be appreciated like that. Now I'd like to, before we get into the subject matter for today, start out with a few quick polling questions. Eddie, and if you can cue these up, these should be very simple yes or no questions. The first one: are you considering including a PCCP in a future FDA submission? The second one: have you already included a PCCP in a previous FDA submission? And finally, do you think that the overall PCC concept is a good idea? However you define good in this context, that's up to you, but do you think it's a good idea? So, Edian, why don't we give the audience a few seconds to respond to those, and then if you can share the results, that would be great.
Okay, looks like we have about 80-20 on considering a PCCP.
Okay.
share those in just a moment. So I just opened the next poll. Have you considered, are you already including a PCP in a previous FDA submission? So we're getting some votes in from that. Looks like we have about 6 people who have included a PCCP in a previous FDA submission.
Okay.
Up to about 8. Give it a few more seconds here for everybody to navigate. And if you're unsure of where to vote, if you go in the top right where it says chat or poll or Q&A, click that poll and you can vote. So it looks like we have 6 who have included a PCCP in a previous FDA submission. So let's ask the question, do you think the overall PCCP concept is a good idea? Just open that one up. We'll leave it open for just a few seconds. There's a few people who think it's not a good idea. So we have 3 that do not so far, or 4. So that's climbing a little bit.
That's exactly why I put the word good in quotes, because that can be interpreted in many different ways.
Okay. Looks like the majority think yes. We have about 5 or 6 that say no. All right.
Okay, terrific. Well, thank you again for everybody who participated in the poll. And Eddie, and thank you for managing that. That helps me kind of understand where we are as an audience so that I can tailor my comments accordingly. All right, so here's what I'm hoping to talk about in the few minutes that we have together today. First of all, what is a PCCP? Why should we consider it? What are the risks and benefits? How early in the product development life cycle should we consider a PCCP? How does the process work and what can we expect? Pardon me, what information do we need to provide FDA as part of this PCCP package? Are there any disadvantages of having a PCCP? And finally, what does a successful PCCP look like? And then in addition to that, I've got a litany of multiple what I call bonus questions, time permitting. Bonus in this context means they were not one of the specific questions in the webinar description, but I've got a bunch of them that I'm going to try to work in again as time allows. And then throughout the webinar, like I do in all of my webinars, I'll be sharing a number of tips and tricks and as many things as I can regarding this topic of PCCPs, and then we'll wrap this up with some final thoughts and I'll send you on your way. So buckle your seatbelts. This is going to be a pretty quick ride, but hopefully you'll not just learn something, but you'll enjoy the ride as well. For anybody that's interested in some of my resources beyond this particular webinar, here is a list of the different podcasts that I've done over the last couple of years on this topic. And just to not bias this too much with, Mike Drew's resources, here are some additional non-Mike resources from FDA and from RAPS and so on that you might find useful as well. So let's start out with this question. Where and when did the PCC concept originate? As a hint, it might not be what you think. It might not be from the FDA. In other words, back in April of 2019, FDA published their position paper, their sort of discussion paper on what has become known as the PCCP. Coincidentally, John Spear and I, Edian's predecessor, did a podcast on AI and ML and medical devices. And this, by the way, was the most listened to podcast in the medical device universe in 2019. And I think that one of the reasons is because I don't want to get into this in this discussion too much, but I basically chastised FDA's concept of the locked algorithm. I think it's an archaic concept, and I think it's really holding us back. And the ideas that I proposed to get past the locked algorithm have now become the PCCP. So that webinar came out in the same month, April of 2019. Could they be coincidence? Perhaps. but I'm not always sure. I have no problem with with FDA doing this, but at least maybe we can give credit where credit is due. On the other hand, as Oscar Wilde said, imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. So if FDA took this idea from me or partly from me, then I'm flattered. Thank you. All right. So more importantly, let's get into the details of our discussion. What is a predetermined change control plan? And then we'll talk about when it should be used. So first of all, the way I like to think about a PCCP, which is exactly what one of the things I proposed in that 2019 webinar that I just mentioned, it's sort of a pre-approved version of either a letter to file, a special 510K, or a PMA supplement. Now, for any of you that are not familiar with any of those things, I have included hyperlinks to webinars and podcasts on these subjects. So when you get the handout, you can just click on those and you can learn much more about that. Another way to think about a PCCP is if you have two or more separate but combined submissions. For example, as we'll talk about, you're going to submit a 510K. You're going to also submit a PCCP or maybe multiple PCCPs along with that. So think about it as sort of, being stapled together. You've got your 510K package. You've got your PCCP number 1 package. You've got maybe your PCCP number 2 package. You staple all that together and you submit it to the FDA. So bottom line, FDA, whether they realize it or not, has opened up a Pandora's box here when it comes to PCCPs. A few of you in the poll a few minutes ago said that you don't think that the PCCP is a good idea. We'll talk more about that in a moment. But in terms of verbiage, as hopefully some of you know, a 510K is cleared, a de novo is granted, a PMA is approved. Okay, that's fine. That's been around for a long time. But now we have this PCCP, which is also approved. Well, it doesn't take much imagination to think that when a company comes out with their press release that our 510K was cleared and or our de novo was granted, oh, by the way, our PCCP was approved. So I just, mentioned that in terms of terminology, I think it's going to make things even more complicated. Moving on to the second part of the first question, when should a PCCP be used? Well, not simply when you anticipate a future change to a device, like, for example, a label expansion, changing the technology a little bit, changing the labeling a little bit or something like that. You can use PCCPs in those situations. I know that FDA says in their guidance you can't, but it's not that clear cut, and I'll get to that in just a moment. But remember, the other thing is you need to be prepared to substantiate your changes. A PCCP is absolutely not a shortcut. And quite frankly, anybody that views a PCCP as a shortcut in that sense really should not be in this business. It's just simply a matter of, in addition to submitting your 510K or your de novo or your PMA for your initial clearance, granting, or approval, you submit your proposal to make a change to this device at some point in the future. When you might do it, that's totally up to you. And you get that change approved as well, so that when you do, say 6 months from now or 2 years from now, or whatever it is, want to pull the trigger and implement the change, you've already got FDA's blessing to do that, and you don't have to submit a special 510K or a PMA supplement or anything like that. So here's my governing equation of the PCCP. As an engineer, one of my frustrations with regulation is a lot of people don't take a quantitative or analytical approach to it, but you can take a mathematical or logical approach. It's what I call regulatory logic here. So in this particular case, a new submission is basically the base submission, which is what I call it, the 510K or the de novo or the PMA, plus the sum of your different label expansions, each one being a different PCCP. So you might have 1, you might have 2, you might have 3, you might even have more. All of these variables that you see in my governing equation are interdependent, but they are also independent of each other. Why? Because as we'll talk about in a moment, we want to structure our submissions so that if FDA is okay with our 510K, but they're not okay with our PCCP, then the PCCP could be rejected independently of the 510K, and the 510K is still cleared. But if you don't organize your submission correctly, if you fail on the PCCP, that might cause the entire ship to sink to the bottom of the ocean. Again, I'll talk more about how we can do that in just a couple of minutes. For those of you that have listened to some of my other webinars, like, for example, my 510K and substantial equivalence webinar, this is similar to my governing equation of the 510K, which basically says, a 510K is substantial equivalence and risk, and substantial equivalence is labeling and technology. So if you substitute equation number 2 back into equation number 1, a successful 510K consists of the labeling and technology, that's the substantial equivalence part, and the risk. So simply put, if you want to have a valid and a defensible solution to that equation, then you'll be likely successful with your 510K. If you don't have a valid or defensible solution, then you're probably not going to be successful with your 510K, and maybe you need to consider a de novo or possibly even a PMA. For those of you that are interested in more on the 510K side, I would point you to my 510K and substantial equivalence webinar, or one of the other resources that I shared in the previous slide. Okay, moving on. What are the 5 guiding principles for PCCPs? This is according to the FDA, but obviously with my commentary superimposed on top of it. So in the PCCP, the first principle is we need to provide reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness and substantial equivalence. That's assuming that it's if it's a 510K. And this is the important part. The totality of the information that we present in the PCCP should enable FDA to assess the reasonable assurance of safety and efficacy or substantial equivalence of our device. As I said a moment ago, the PCCP is not a shortcut. You cannot just simply say to the FDA in your PCCP, oh, by the way, we're planning on changing the material of our device in the future, or the manufacturing of method of our device in the future, and then not say anything else about it. Not only do you have to include the details of exactly what you're going to change and why you're going to change it, you also have to include the V&V data to support that change. In other words, you have to collect that data in advance, because remember, if your PCCP is granted, and again, this is another important point that a lot of people do not understand, if your PCCP is successful and it's approved, I didn't mean granted. I mean, if it's approved, then you will have no more communication with the FDA regarding this particular change. So they want to basically make sure that you have all of your ducks in a row, so to speak. You have your data in hand. You cannot do a promissory note to say, well, we'll plan on collecting the data if and when we make the change. No. You can't do that. If you want the PCCP today, you've got to give FDA all of your information today. The second principle is that it might be the least burdensome option. The key phrase here is it may be. That's ultimately up to you, not to the FDA to decide. As we're going to talk about in more detail, there are advantages and disadvantages to either doing a PCCP or not doing a PCCP. But at the end of the day, it's up to you to decide if you want to do it or not. It's obviously not required. PCCPs are part of the marketing authorization. The manufacturer is required to implement the modifications consistent with their authorized PCCP when the manufacturer chooses to do so. But notice that's a direct quote from the guidance. It does not say you must implement the change eventually. As a matter of fact, FDA cannot force you to make a change to your device, even if you have an approved PCCP. So you can implement that change anytime that you want in the future. That's what they're saying here. It has to be consistent with the authorized PCCP. You can't make deviations from your authorized PCCP. Otherwise, that's going to lead to other problems. But it's not telling you that at some point in the future, the PCCP has to be implemented. PCCPs are specific. They need to be very, very specific modifications and have very, very specific details In several of the PCCPs that I've been involved with before, when my customer shares their PCCP with me prior to the submission, which they almost always do, I tell them this is way too high level, this is way too vague, this is way too non-specific. We really need to get into the nuts and bolts here, exactly like you would do in your 510K or your de novo or your PMA. So think of the PCCP as nothing more than, if it's a class 2 substantially equivalent device, think of it nothing more than a special 510K where you would need all of that information, or a PMA supplement where you would also need all of that information. But instead of doing the special 510K or PMA supplement later, after your 510K is cleared or your PMA is approved, you do it all at the same time. Okay, so it has to be very, very specific, no generalities, and the modifications that you do propose must maintain the device within the device's intended use, and must allow the device to remain substantially equivalent to the predicate device. That's the direct quote from the guidance. However, I have at least two major problems with that. First of all, why the heck can we not even make a change to the device's intended use? Admittedly, this is going to make for a very complicated PCCP, but when you look at the regulation that came from Congress, I'm not talking about the guidance here, I'm talking about the regulation. There's no reason that I can see why a company could not use a PCCP to do a label expansion by adding a new intended use or a new indication if they really wanted to. I'm not suggesting that they should do that as a PCCP, but I'm suggesting that they could do that, and I'm looking forward to pushing back on the FDA. I've got a couple of customers that are considering doing this to say, hey, we want to do this as a PCCP, even though in your guidance it says you can't. Remember, guidance is only suggestion, it's not regulation. And regarding the other comment, must allow the device to remain substantially equivalent to the predicate. Well, that's all well and good when you're talking about 510K devices, but for de novos and for PMAs, what the heck does that mean? If we make if we get a de novo, and I'll show you some examples of this in a moment, if we get a de novo and we also get, include a PCCP, do I need to show that my changed de novo is substantially equivalent to the original de novo? That just doesn't make any sense. And of course, in the PMA universe, as most of you know, we don't even have a concept of substantial equivalence, at least not in the regulatory sense. So as I said, there is a bit of a Pandora's box here that all of us are trying to figure out. And finally, the last guiding principle is PCCPs are intended to fit within the existing FDA device modification guidelines. So for example, we have the letter to file option, we have the special 510K and the PMA supplement option. Those options have been around for a long time, and now we have this relatively new PCCP option. I would put all of those in the same sentence because they're just different ways of doing exactly the same thing. So how do we determine if a future change is what I call PCCP-able? And yes, I did make up that word. I don't think it's obviously a real word, but kind of like 510K-able. How do we determine if a future change is PCCP-able? Well, here is a flowchart that's provided in one of the two PCCP guidance, which I'll talk more about in a moment. But let's take a look at this first arm of the flowchart. The first question is, could the modification be a major change or modification to the intended use? If the answer is yes, then automatically the flowchart says the modification is not generally appropriate for inclusion in a PCCP. As I alluded to a moment ago, why the heck not? We should, if we want to. I'm not suggesting that we should, but we should be allowed, if we want to make a change to the labeling, even a major change to the labeling, not just the intended use, but more importantly, the indications to use under a PCCP. And I have a feeling that when somebody, whether it's me or somebody else, challenges FDA on this, I think they're probably going to lose, because I just don't see the regulatory logic to support this limitation if it's done properly. If we look at the other arms of the flowchart, for example, could the modification significantly affect the safety and efficacy of the device? Could it introduce a new risk, or could it modify what they really mean there is increase in existing risk? Then might not be appropriate for a PCCP. However, what I would point out is that this is exactly the criteria for the de novo, right? A de novo is we use basically when there's no predicate or no suitable predicate, I should say, and there are new or additional questions of safety and efficacy, and there are new or increases in the known risks. So this is right out of the 510K requirements. I don't know why that it needs to be reiterated here. And finally, and perhaps the most important part of this slide, is you see a couple of different boxes here where it says modification is generally not appropriate. Modification is generally not appropriate for a PCCP. Notice it's not saying that it's not appropriate. It says it's generally not appropriate. So just like Ronald Reagan mantra, trust but verify. If you're planning on doing something as a PCCP, I would confirm that with the agency in advance, usually in the form of a pre-sub. And I'll talk about some of the challenges of doing a PCCP in a pre-sub towards the end of the webinar. Okay, what kinds of devices can utilize a PCCP? Well, the PCCP program, when it originated a couple of years ago, led to this particular guidance that was specifically limited to AI and ML enabled software as medical devices. In other words, it was limited to only software devices that had AI and ML. And as I talked about in my 2019 webinar that led to this whole idea, this makes sense because this allows us to get past this archaic notion of a locked algorithm. In other words, the idea that I proposed at that time, which is now in the guidance, is you do, I think at the time I call it a pre-validation, where I say, okay, I'm going to allow my software to modify itself, to learn, to evolve, to make changes in itself, but I'm not going to let it do it, however it wants. I'm going to say, okay, Mr. or Mrs. Software, and please notice I'm treating the software, AI software, as a person. Or as a company, and I'm doing that on purpose because true artificial intelligence should be thought of that way. I say, Mr. or Mrs. AI software, you can make the following change in temperature, in power, in duration, whatever it is, as long as you stay between this particular range between X and Y. And what we do is we pre-validate that range such that as long as the software modifies itself and stays within that range between X and Y, we know that it will work. We know that it's safe and effective. We know that risk is not a problem, and so on and so on. So this was one of the ideas that I suggested to get us past this locked algorithm. Well, a little bit further down the road, FDA decided to expand the program even further, and this is the most recent guidance just from a couple of months ago that applies to all regulated medical devices across the board, not just software. So I know that the PCCP program as it exists today, most of the press is surrounding software devices that use AI. However, now we can use it for anything that we want, for catheters, for heart valves, for in vitro diagnostics, for software that doesn't involve AI, for literally anything that you want. The question is, does a PCCP for a non-AI SAMD make sense? I'm not sure, to be honest with you. I have sort of mixed feelings on that. I'm not sure that it's really needed because we have the special 510K and the PMA and the letter to file options already. I know that some people will say, it will save time in the long run. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. We'll talk more about that in a few minutes as well, but ultimately time will tell. So I'm not saying that if you don't have an AI enabled SAMD that you should not consider a PCCP. It is a legitimate regulatory tool today, so you should definitely consider it. But whether you choose to use it or not for a non-software device, that's an interesting discussion. Okay, so what kind of examples of modifications can we do that may or may not be appropriate in a PCCP for a 510K or a de novo? These are some modifications that may be appropriate. I've taken some of these from FDA's guidance and I've modified some of them, but changes in some aspects of the design. However, it has to be sort of a relatively minor or cosmetic change. If you're going to change the design to the point that affects your mechanism of action of your device, then it's probably not going to be PCCP-able. A change in sterilization or packaging or something, as long as you're using, pardon me, well-established methods, changes in materials or components. Again, this is a real Pandora's box here, because showing substantial equivalence between two different materials is not always an easy thing. Those of you that have heard me before, you know that I'm a subject matter expert for FDA in a couple of different areas, one of them being biomaterials and biocompatibility. So it will be interesting to see how companies, implement a PCCP when it comes to materials. Software, as long as it's consistent with the intended use. Labeling to specify a use of a device with an additional device. This gets into compatibility issues and so on. And if you want to add home use, if we want to change the intended use environment. Those are some of the examples of changes that might be appropriate for a PCCP. On the other hand, some examples of modifications that might not be appropriate. Change to the operating principle, or as I said, the mechanism of action, including the intended use. Change from the device labeling from single use to reusable, removal or editing contraindications, changing from prescriptive to OTC. Some of these, by the way, I think are perfectly valid for PCCPs. For example, I would have no problem putting in a PCCP for changing from prescriptive status to OTC status, as long as I have all of the information in there that would support the OTC label expansion. Right. So if you view this PCCP as nothing more than, another 510K de novo or PMA, then we should be able to do many, if not most, of these things. So anyway, you get the idea. But this is such a high level description coming from the guidance that I question whether or not it's detailed enough to be useful or actionable. And it's up to you to decide whether a particular change that you're considering is PCCP-able or not. But then remember Ronald Reagan's mantra: trust but verify. Take it to the FDA, usually as a pre-sub, and say, in addition to our 510K, oh, by the way, we're planning on submitting this PCCP or these PCPs, plural, and this is, what we're going to put into them, and so on and so on and so on. Here are some examples, first on the top of the screen, of actual 510K cleared devices with approved PCCPs, and then below some examples of actual devices that have been granted a de novo with one or more PCCPs as well. I'm not going to talk about all of these individually. I am going to talk about a couple of them before the end of the webinar. And here's one, Apple. They have what they call an irregular rhythm notification feature, or IRNF. This is part of their Fitbit series of devices. And for those that are not familiar, let me try to share with you a video on this. Hopefully this will.
Her heart was going over 200 beats a minute.
I was gifted an Apple Watch for Christmas. From that point on, every time I would.
I just want to confirm that you're able to hear the video. Edian, can you hear it?
Yeah, we can hear it.
Great.
Feel weird. I would look at my watch and the numbers were just going higher and higher and higher. The highest I've seen is 206. I felt like I was going to die. Felt like someone was stressed, dizzy, sweating. It would only last 5 minutes, but that was scary 5 minutes. I just thought I was out of shape. Needed to work out, some cardio. I would always be out of breath.
She was having very strong symptoms. We put a
Okay, for the sake of time, I think I'm going to cut that short. I think you get the idea. But basically, what happened here is there are obviously a number of 510Ks on the Apple Watch, but this particular one, K231173, it was cleared by the FDA. And here's a what you're looking at here is right off the FDA's website, the 510K summary for this particular product. And I just want to scroll down to the section where they have the verbiage specifically on, here we go, specifically on the PCCP. So this is in the 510K summaries. One of the downsides of doing a PCCP is a successful PCCP will end up showing up in your 510K summary, your de novo summary, or your PMA summary, which is obviously publicly available. And so the question to you as the manufacturer is, are you going to want to disclose to the rest of the world, not the least of which is your competition, what your anticipated changes are going to be in your device before you even make them? So this is just one example, and I have a couple of other examples that we'll get to in just a second. Actually, here's another quick example. This is an imaging device, and for those that are not familiar, this was a de novo, but watch this video.
Sarah will be demonstrating how to perform an echocardiogram with Caption AI. To start, Sarah chooses a protocol to follow. Caption AI allows users to create custom protocols with up to 10 standard cardiac views based on workflow needs or patient indication. Sarah will select parasternal long axis view. She uses the diagram in the lower right to position the trend. Above that is a reference image that shows her what the view she's scanning for should look like. Following the prompts at the top, Sarah makes.
Okay, so once again, for the sake of time, I'm going to cut the video short. You have access to the full videos via the link. Those are videos that are available on the internet. So if you want, you can go back and watch the whole thing. This came to the market as a de novo, not like the Apple Watch we just talked about as a 510K. But the interesting thing about this is, those of you that know something about the de novo, you know that a successful de novo leads, among other things, to the creation of a new product code. And notice the title of this particular product code, radiological machine learning based quantitative imaging software. Okay, fine. That's a bunch of, regulatory and medical gobbledygook. But here's the important point: with a predetermined change protocol plan, a PCCP. So if we go to product code QVD and we look at this, here it is. They truncated one word. They didn't say predetermined, but it specifically says predetermined, a PCCP, which kind of begs the question in the future. If you want to do a if you want to do a 510K based on this device and you want to fit into the QVD product code, are you going to also have to submit a PCCP? I think that's a very interesting question, and I think that a company, should be able to allow to make a substantial equivalent argument independent of whether or not they want to use a PCCP. That's a completely separate discussion. But because the program is still relatively new, there's not a lot of precedent in this area, and this is going to be another thing that we're going to have to probably battle with the FDA a little bit, which I would argue is a good thing. And if we look at the one last thing on this case, if we look at the de novo summary, again, this is publicly available information. I want to scroll down to here we have this section here. A very robust section in the de novo summary, specifically entitled Predetermined Change Control Plan. And again, I'm not going to go through the details. You can look at this individually if you want to, but it's spelled out in a certain amount of detail, at least for the summary of what actually goes in there. So that was part of the de novo. Technically, it was not really part of the de novo. It was stapled to the de novo, because remember, the PCCP is separate from the 510K or the de novo, but they're related to one another. So that's another example. Okay, one of my customers recently asked me, is there a cost or a user fee for including PCPs in a submission? The short answer is not yet, but as I said, like with pre-subs, there's no pre-sub user fee either. But give Congress some time, especially in light of the recent U.S. Elections that we had just a week or so ago. I have a feeling that this might change. I'm not suggesting that I think it should change, but it might change. But even from a commonsensical perspective with regard to the PCCP, one way that you can think of a PCCP is a sort of a clever way of avoiding an additional MDUFA user fee. In other words, if you submit a 510K and then you want to make a change and submit a special 510K after it, you're going to have to pay 2 510K user fees. Instead, if you submit a 510K and a PCCP, you only have to pay 1 user fee. So this is sort of a clever way of avoiding an additional user fee, perhaps, but the question is, should we do this? In other words, does it make sense? This is a good idea. The cost of a 510K with 1 or more PCCPs should be the same as the cost of a 510K with no PCCPs. To me, that makes absolutely no sense because having 1 or more PCCPs as part of the review process is obviously going to increase the time and effort and resources that it takes FDA to evaluate that. Just like de novo user fees are higher than 510Ks and PMA user fees are higher than de novos because it's based on, to a certain extent anyway, it's based on the time and the effort that FDA has to take to evaluate the information. So for right now, no user fees for PCCPs, but don't be surprised if that doesn't change pretty soon. I did, for those of you that are not familiar, include the 2025 user fees on this slide, and there's a link you can go to the FDA's website to fact check that yourself. Is the concept of the PCCP unique to medical devices? So far, yes. Because if those of you that know something about the drug or the biologic world, there's nothing even remotely similar to the PCCP in the drug or biologic universe. I don't think there's a snowball's chance here in Southern California that CDER, the drug folks at FDA, or CBER, the biologics folks at FDA, are going to be comfortable with this whole concept of getting changes approved in advance. I just don't think that's going to happen. Well, given that, what about when we get into combination products? And for those that are interested, I did a webinar on combination products for Greenlight, and you can go to, click on that hyperlink and you can see it. I've put out lots of different info on combination products, and you have a slide with my different resources. I've been working in combo products now for more than 20 years, probably, long before most people had even heard that phrase. So the question is, are we going to be able to use a PCCP in a combination product? Well, my take is yes, if the PMOA, that's the primary mode of action of the combination product, is device, not drug or biologic. If it's device, then the PCCP is possible. If the PMOA is not equal to device, then whether you'll be able to do a PCCP on it is an open question. But as I said, I don't think that, let's put it this way, I think it's going to be very difficult for my friends in CDER and CBER to swallow the PCCP pill. I just don't think that's going to happen. But there's a further caveat, there's a further assumption, and that is the PMOA not only has to be the device, but the change that you're proposing in your PCCP needs to be to the device component of the combination product, not to the drug or the biologic component. If you can satisfy those two criteria, if you will, then you can do a PCCP on a combination product. I know this sounds like it's complicated, and in combination products, it becomes even more complicated. But, at the end of the day, somebody has to be the first to try this. Or do we want to wait for the FDA to tell us what to do? I certainly hope not. So let's take an example of a more complicated situation. We looked at a couple of other devices before that were much, much simpler. We looked at a 510K and a de novo. Here is a combination product. This is perhaps one of the best known examples of a combination product, and that is the drug-eluting stent. In the interest of full disclosure, I was the principal architect of the regulatory strategy for the first two drug-eluting stents that came onto the market here in the United States quite some time ago now. So this particular product, in the FDA's guidance, they call it a device. Shame on them. It's not a device. It's really a combination product. A coronary drug-eluting stent is a device-led combination product coated with sirolimus, that's a drug, that's an anti-inflammatory, in a polymer intended to inhibit restenosis. So this is more complicated because it's a combination product and because it's class 3, meaning PMA or possibly HDE. So if we want to make a change, and this is now going to I guess, supersede the change management guidance that FDA has put out for combination products, because that's inconsistent with what's in this new guidance. But if you want to make a change to your drug-eluting stent, some examples could include things like if you have an alternative delivery system component supplier. This is a supplier. This is not a change in the device itself, but this is a supplier. And the reason why is because in the PMA world, unlike in the 510K or de novo world, the regulation is more strict. And unlike a 510K, you cannot simply willy-nilly change a supplier from one day to the next. So if you want to pre-qualify a supplier for a class 3 device, you could use a PCCP to do that. However, there's some additional caveats. The component specs and the design requirements have to be identical, not substantially equivalent, but identical to the currently approved product. You might also consider a PCCP if you want to expand your product line and add additional sizes. But again, there's some caveats, like it has to be the same design. And most importantly, it has to be within the range of dimensions. So consider this. Let's say, for example, you have 2 stents on the market now. One is, I'm just going to make up some numbers here. One is 5 millimeters in diameter, and the other is 8 millimeters in diameter. And your marketing people come back and say, well, we want to add some sizes in between. We want to have a 6 millimeter diameter and a 7 millimeter diameter stent. That was not part of your original PMA submission. You could propose those changes under the PCCP as long as, and this is exactly what I described in my 2019 webinar, as long as you're within those boundaries, because you've already done that V&V testing to show that the 5 millimeter and 8 millimeter diameter are fine, and now we're adding 6 and 7. If you want to go below that, if you want to add, say, a 3 millimeter diameter, or if you want to go above the upper limit, if you want to add, say, a 10 millimeter diameter, I think it's going to be extremely difficult, maybe not impossible, but extremely difficult for it to do that under the context of a PCCP, especially in the PMA universe, because going outside of those pre-validated boundaries, if you will, could certainly add new questions of safety and efficacy, could certainly change the overall risk. And so for all of those reasons, I think it's going to be difficult, again, maybe not impossible, but certainly difficult to get FDA to swallow that pill. And finally, you have to show that you're using the same manufacturing processes as well. Another thing that I would point out is, because most of you probably work in the 510K or the de novo universe, in the 510K submission, there are no requirements whatsoever to include any manufacturing information in your 510K. You can if you want to, but you don't have to. In the de novo, you're not required to either, although in some cases, as of about 2 or 3 years ago, Congress gave FDA the discretionary authority to ask for manufacturing information in a de novo. It doesn't happen very often, but they can. However, in the PMA universe, there's no ambiguity about it. You must include your manufacturing methods in your PMA submission. And consequently, if you're going to do a PCCP based on that PMA, you have to show that your manufacturing methods have not changed, which also begs the question, if you want to propose a change in your manufacturing method in a PMA device, why can't we do that in a PCCP? My personal opinion is I think we should. And I have a couple of companies now that are investigating that as an option. The modifications that might not be appropriate if you change the drug in any way, the dose, the kinetics, the polymer, and so on, obviously you cannot do that in a PCCP. And anybody that, is in this business and tries to do that, they just shouldn't be in this business. I'm not trying to be, overly flippant, but, that's just, that just makes sense. A change in the manufacturing that impacts the drug coating. So if you change the manufacturing that impacts only the stent, that's eligible for the PCCP. However, you would have to make sure that you can prove that your manufacturing change does not impact the drug as well. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. Change in the labeling, for example, expanding the limit for your post-dilation expansion, that would be difficult to do in a PCCP. And finally, changing the labeling to include new indications. I talked about that before, that we should be allowed to do that. Here are some additional resources specifically on combination products. I've been saying now for probably 20 years that combination products are clearly the future of medicine. I don't think there's any doubt about that anymore. And now we have the opportunity to use PCCPs, at least in certain types of combination products, specifically device-led combination products, as we just discussed. Okay, a few other questions, and we're getting close to the point of stopping and opening up for Q&A. So be thinking of some questions that you would like to ask, and then we'll discuss them in the last several minutes of our time together. How many PCPs can you include in a single submission? Well, the short answer is really as many as you want. However, there are several caveats. One is obviously as the number of PCCPs increases, your overall regulatory risk increases. In other words, if you don't structure your submission properly, if FDA, let's say you submit a de novo with 3 PCCPs and FDA doesn't like one of your 3 PCCPs, but they like everything else. If you don't structure your submission properly, the entire submission is going to fail. The ship is going to sink to the bottom of the ocean. So how do you mitigate this risk? It's very simple. You create very separate and distinct boundaries between your, what I call your base submission, your 510K or de novo or whatever it is, and the PCCPs that come along after. You create very distinct boundaries such that if FDA has a problem with one of them, but they're okay with the other things, then you might decide to negotiate with FDA to see if you can solve the problem, or if it's going to be too difficult, you remove the PCCP and you still get the 510K, which is your base submission or whatever it is. So the greater the number of PCCPs, the greater the overall regulatory risk, but you can mitigate that risk. Also, as we increase the number of PCCPs, you increase the overall regulatory burden. In other words, because the PCCP, as I said before, is not a shortcut, you have to include all of your V&V testing, your data, to support whatever changes you're proposing to make in the future. Obviously, that's going to take time and money to do that. That's going to be above and beyond your base submission, your base 510K or de novo or PMA. Therefore, you have to sort of do a calculation as to, whether the additional time and money that you spend in the short term to include the PCCP is going to be great enough to offset the time and the money that you lose because your product is not on the market yet. So again, that's a calculation that I go through with all of my customers when they're considering a PCCP. As we increase the PCCPs, it may or may not increase the overall time or amount of money. I don't think this is nearly as clear-cut as a lot of people think. In some cases, it probably will. In other cases, it probably won't. But again, that's a calculation that you have to do yourself. Remember, like a BDP, a breakthrough designation device, a PCCP is not a shortcut, nor should it be. A BDP, and for those of you that are not familiar with it, you can click on that link. It'll take you to my BDP webinar that I did. A BDP is not an alternative to a 510K or de novo or PMA or HDE. It's an addition to. It's sort of supposed to be for the best of the best. I've got now somewhere approaching 25 devices actually in the BDP program, including some combination products as well. So I don't think there's anybody that has more experience with BDPs than I do. If this is something that you're considering, feel free to reach out to me or check out some of my BDP resources. I'd be happy to help if I can. So in the end, are PCCPs worth it? Well, the shortest, the most accurate answer to every question in regulatory affairs, including this one, is it depends. It depends on the company. It depends on the device and the technology. It depends on what your goals are, and so on and so on. In some cases, if you're a startup and you need to get a device onto the market as fast as you possibly can in order to satisfy your VCs or your angel investors, then you might say, you know what? The PCCP is not, what's the expression? The juice is not worth the squeeze, because it's better for us to get a 510K cleared quickly than it is to get a 510K cleared in a longer time because it has a PCCP. On the other hand, if you're working in an established device company where maybe time to market is not quite as important, of course, time to market is always important, but maybe it's not quite as important, you might decide that a PCCP is, the juice is worth the squeeze, so to speak. So I can guarantee in one set of circumstances, one company might decide to do a PCCP, and in another set of exactly the same circumstances, another company might decide not to do a PCCP. It's up to you. A couple of other things, and then we're going to wrap this up. Are all PCCPs created equal? Or in other words, what is the regulatory burden of various PCPs? Shorter answer is absolutely not. In general, the regulatory burden of a PCCP for a 510K is less than that of a de novo, is less than that of a PMA. And the question is why? It should make common sense to anybody that has an IQ of more than 5 that the regulatory burden for a 510K in general is going to be lower than a de novo, it's going to be lower than a PMA because the risks are less. The technology is probably well established. We have a good understanding of the risks and benefits. As we get into the de novo universe or the PMA universe, the pathophysiologies become more complicated. The comorbidities often become more complicated. Sometimes the manufacturing methods become more complicated. So bottom line, a PCCP for a 510K should not look like that of a de novo or a PMA. It should have the same structure. It should have the same sections, if you will, but the level of detail in the PCCP for a 510K is going to be lower than that of a de novo, and it's going to be lower than that of a PMA. How early in the product development life cycle should we consider a PCCP if that's something that we're considering? Well, I would say as early as possible. I often ask companies to give me what I call their future features list. In other words, don't just tell me all of the bells and whistles and claims that you want to make in your current device. Tell me what's in your queue. What kinds of bells and whistles and claims would you like to make in the future? And then we evaluate the regulatory risk and the regulatory burden of each one. And with that information, I can advise the company, okay, these are bells and whistles that we should include in our base submission, or these are bells and whistles that we can propose to include as a PCCP, or maybe these are bells and whistles that we should not mention at all in this initial submission and save it for later on. Bottom line, the more a company can share with me what their goals are, not just what they want to do now or today, but what they want to do in the future, the more I can do to help them. In other words, can you read what's not on the page? I love this quote from Steve Jobs. People don't know what they want until you show it to them. That's why I, meaning Steve Jobs, never rely on market research. Our task is to read things that are not yet on the page. Read things that are not yet on the page. Regulation is exactly the same thing. So many of my regulatory colleagues, they focus the regulation that is written on the page. And while that is certainly important, oftentimes that's not nearly as important as what is not written on the page. And just remember, this applies to not just doctors and engineers, but regulatory professionals as well. So my recommendation here, don't waste FDA's time, for the company rather, don't waste FDA's time or insult their intelligence by asking questions that you should already know the answers to. Do your homework or get external help from somebody like me or somebody else. In other words, you want to demonstrate that you know what you're doing. And to my many friends at the FDA, don't waste the company's time or insult their intelligence by simply providing very generic or high-level advice like follow the guidance, Well, duh. Thank you, FDA, for telling me that. I would have never thought of that. And if the company is not prepared, then FDA, you should call them out on that. In other words, you should literally say, and I have said this as an FDA consultant before, maybe this is not politically correct, but hey, you're not ready for this. Don't waste my time. Come back to me when you have something to talk about. Right? So do your homework. Your suggestions, meaning FDA suggestions, should be specific to that particular device, not general, like read a guidance. We should all act like and be treated as medical device professionals. And I use that word professional very, very intentionally. A surgeon is considered a professional, and because of that, he or she is held responsible for what he or she does as well as they don't do. Well, if we're going to call ourselves medical device or regulatory professionals, I do not use that term lightly. Along with that comes the responsibility of, quite frankly, knowing what the heck you're doing. And unfortunately, in this business, not everybody does. Maybe that's not politically correct to say anymore in this era of everybody shows up, gets a trophy. I don't know. But just because somebody might not want to say it doesn't mean that it's not true. Something to think about that. How does this PCC process work, and what can we expect? So there's basically a few steps. First is you prepare what I call your base submission and your PCCPs. I would recommend including in the intro or the cover letter an explanation of your regulatory strategy. In literature, we would call this foreshadowing. In other words, my base submission is a PMA, and following that, I'm going to give you 2 PCCPs or something like that. Clearly separate, literally with very, very definitive lines, your base submission from your 1 or more PCCPs, so that if FDA has a problem with one, it doesn't get commingled into the other. And make sure that you're not missing or forgetting any information. We don't yet have a refuse to accept or RTA checklist for PCCPs. Do we need one? I would hope not. I would hope that we would not need RTA checklists for 510Ks, de novos, and PMAs, which we already have, by the way. I would like to think that the people working in this business know what they're doing, but unfortunately, that's not always the case. When I used to teach medical school, I was reminded of the old joke, what do you call the person that graduates last in their class in medical school? Doctor. The same thing applies here. Once you do that, you submit it to the FDA. They review each component individually, but they also will obviously look at them collectively. And then at the end of the process, the company and the FDA hopefully will work together to discuss, if necessary, to negotiate and finally to decide, is the base submission, cleared or approved? Are the PCCPs cleared or approved, and so on and so on. Some of you have probably heard me use the poker metaphor. I consider the entire relationship between the company and the FDA as a poker game in every sense of the word. And just because somebody understands the rules of poker doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be a good poker player, doesn't mean they're going to win the game. I want to do everything that I can, legal, of course. I don't want to be wearing any orange jumpsuits in order to win the game. In other words, you can read 50 books on the rules of poker. Does that mean that you're going to be a good poker player? Does that mean that you're going to win the game? Absolutely not. The strategy here is most important. The tactics, in other words, how you fill out the forms and the paperwork, yeah, that's okay. That's important. But what is much, much more important is the strategy. What information should be provided in the PCCP package? Again, I just want to go through this very quickly because we're running short on time. A description of the modification that you're planning on proposing. They need to be very, very specific. The modification protocol, where you describe your V&V, how you're going to do it, and the data and so on, and then your impact assessment, which is basically nothing more than a risk versus benefit kind of a thing to decide, how it meets the previous two. This is all the guidance that FDA provides in terms of the components of the PCCP. The question is this enough? I would say absolutely not. And unless and until FDA goes back and adds additional color to that guidance, and I think they'll probably do that if and when the PCCP program becomes more popular. Right now, it's still relatively new. The question is, what do you do in the meantime? Well, design your submission, including your PCCPs, like you design your device. One of my many popular webinars is design your label like you design your device. I'm taking the same approach here. Design your submission like you design your device. And another question, which I think will be interesting for anybody at Greenlight that wants to chime in. My recommendation to companies is to put a PCCP SOP and maybe even a PCCP template in your quality management system. Right now, it's not required. It's not part of the QSR, the quality system regulation, but maybe it should be, at least for companies that are considering this as an option. Are there disadvantages of a PCP? Absolutely. There's advantages and disadvantages to everything. Submitting a PCCP automatically assumes that you know what your anticipated change is going to be in advance. In other words, at the time of the submission. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. Obviously, you cannot submit a PCCP on a change that you don't know about or haven't thought about yet. It assumes that you have the evidence to support those anticipated changes. And as I said before, collecting evidence will likely delay the submission and increase the review time and increase the regulatory burden. If you're going to do a pre-sub for a PCCP, it is going to make the pre-sub more complicated, and that will be the last thing that I talk about in just a moment. If your PCCP fails, if you don't construct your submission properly, then the entire ship sinks to the bottom of the ocean. So decouple them. Decouple your base submission from each one of your PCCPs if there is in fact more than one. If the PCCP is part of a cleared or approved submission, it will be publicly available in your summary. It will also be subject to a Freedom of Information or FOI request. I showed you examples of the summary. So just be careful because you're disclosing to the rest of the world, including your competition, kind of what's in your product development future, what kinds of changes to your product that you want to make. Not all companies might want to do that, right? So everybody, including your competitors, will know what your future generation device or devices is going to look like before you've made the change, before it's on the market. So how many companies are going to be wanting to do this? I'm not sure. It's an interesting question. Let me just skip this one. Finally, we get to the topic of, should I include a PCCP in a pre-sub? As some of you know, I have a tremendous amount of pre-sub experience. I'm doing with pre-subs at FDA on average about once, sometimes twice a month. So I do a lot of pre-subs. When it comes to PCCPs, first of all, on the risk side, it violates one of my cardinal rules of pre-subs, and that is stick to the current device only. Don't talk about any other devices. Don't talk about any future devices and so on and so on. But if you're going to include a PCCP, by definition, that's going to violate this cardinal rule because you're talking about a proposed change, which will lead to a new device. So this will undoubtedly make pre-subs much more confusing, much more complicated. However, you can mitigate this risk, and I've done now probably about a half a dozen pre-subs that included a PCCP in it. You can mitigate that risk by establishing very, very distinct boundaries. In other words, building walls. Some people actually do it literally by the clock. You say, okay, for the first 35 minutes of the meeting, we're going to talk about our base submission only, our 510K or de novo or whatever it is. And then for the remaining 15 or 20 minutes of the meeting, we're going to talk about PCCP number 1 and PCCP number 2. That's one way of avoiding the confusion of people in the audience asking, okay, is what you're talking about now, is that part of your base submission or is that part of your PCCP? It's just, it's a solvable problem, but unless you manage this properly, it's going to be a mess. On the benefit side, advanced communication with FDA is almost always, not all the time, but most of the time, beneficial. I view the pre-sub as cheap insurance, just to make sure that FDA and the company is all on the same page. We're all pulling in the same direction. So for those of you that have heard me before, you're probably familiar with my regulatory mantra when it comes to communicating with the FDA, and that is tell, don't ask, lead, don't follow, and learn, don't bash. The same applies for PCCPs as well. Here are some of my pre-sub resources, should any of you be interested. And finally, last and certainly not least, a PCCP, what does that mean in the Class 3 or PMA or HDE or PDP universe? Well, the guidance makes it very, very clear that you can do a PCCP for a Class 3 PMA device. And I showed you the example of the drug-eluting stent, which is the combination product. But there's very little precedent for doing PCCPs in the Class 3 universe, at least thus far. As some of you probably know, we have a lot of wiggle room, to be frank, in making post-market changes to 510K and de novo devices. That's the whole concept of the letter to file. However, in the Class 3 universe, we have very much less wiggle room. I don't want to say that we don't have any wiggle room, but certainly the amount of wiggle room that we have in the Class 3 universe to make post-market changes is much, 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 much less than in the Class 2 or below universe. For those of you that are not familiar with these different pathways, once again, I would point you to my webinar on pathways to market, where I talk about all of the different pathways to market that are possible for medical devices here in the United States. And finally, should I include the PCCP procedures or standard operating procedures or templates in my QMS? I would say absolutely. After all, it's part of your change management, and the QSR does require you to have a section of your QMS on change management. So this is just sort of an extension of that. Do we need to add this to the QSR? Well, I would like to think not, because I would like to think that most people think that it's common sense, but we all know that common sense is not as common as you might think. So just to wrap this up, what's the takeaway? And then we'll have the last several minutes for questions. If you're anticipating making some post-market changes to your device that's not yet cleared or approved, consider a PCCP, obviously, to include those as part of your base submission or along with your base submission, but also consider your other options: the letter to file, the special 510K, the PMA supplement. As I said, in some cases, some companies might go the PCCP route, but in other cases, in exactly the same circumstances, a company might decide to go the letter to file or special 510K or PMA supplement route or something. You have to decide what is best for you in your particular circumstances. If you're considering using a PCP, consider if it's worth it to you, and if so, when should you start thinking about it and doing it? As I said, usually earlier is better, and probably incorporate it into your PCCP. Incorporate it into your pre-sub, as I just say in the next bullet. Share your regulatory strategy with the FDA in advance, usually in the form of the pre-sub, but there's other ways that you can do it as well. But make sure that you manage that pre-sub properly. I sat in as an FDA consultant with one company's pre-sub that had, I think, 2 PCCPs. I was not working on the company side. I was working on the FDA side at that time. And long story short, the pre-sub turned out to be a disaster, an absolute disaster. People walked out of the room more confused than when they walked into the room an hour before. And the main reason, the root cause, as I would call it, is because the company did not manage their pre-sub properly with those PCCPs. Design your entire submission, including PCCPs, if you have them, as independent but also interdependent modules, and then be prepared to negotiate, so that if you can't convince FDA on one component, it's not going to cause the entire ship to sink to the bottom of the ocean. There's not a lot of PCC precedent yet, although I suspect that it's going to be increasing. Thus far, the vast majority of PCCPs have been in the software world for all the obvious reasons. But I think, there's some interesting examples of products that don't involve any software whatsoever. I mentioned the drug-eluting stent. FDA in their guidance has a few other examples of non-software based devices as well. So I think the popularity of some of those might be increasing as well. Remember, as Ralph Waldo Emerson said, do not go where the path may lead, go instead where there is no path and leave a trail. So don't just limit yourself to the way that people have been doing things in the past. If it's to your advantage to follow in their footsteps, then terrific. But if not, then don't be afraid to carve out your own path. So what we've talked about today in the last minutes is a lot about the PCCP with a lot of different examples and pros and cons and risks and benefits. Remember, average regulatory professionals know the rules. The best ones know the exceptions. And as James Thurber said, there's no exception to the rule that every rule has an exception. That's classic in the regulatory world, PCCPs as well. Finally, there are a lot of regulatory consultants out there, but there are, in my opinion, very few good ones. So how do you become a good one? It's simple. Learn when to follow, but more importantly, learn when to lead. If it's to my advantage to follow in somebody else's footsteps, then great, I will do that. But if it's not to my advantage, or if it's not possible, I will be the first to work with the FDA to carve out a new path. Because if a person wants to lead the orchestra, they must first turn their back on the crowd. And regrettably, this is a philosophy that not many in the regulatory world share, but it's one of my philosophies. And finally, don't just follow the rules, think. Douglas MacArthur said rules are mostly made to be broken and are too often for the lazy to hide behind. Now, please don't miss my message here. I'm not saying that rules are not important. I'm not saying that you shouldn't follow them. I'm certainly not advocating anarchy, but what I am saying is this. If the rules make sense, then by all means follow them. But if the rules don't make sense, and we follow them anyway, and we agree that we don't make sense, and we follow them anyway, is that a problem with the system, or is the problem with us? Every week, sometimes every day, as not just as a regulatory consultant, but as a professional biomedical engineer, I read rules that make absolutely no sense, and yet people follow them anyway. Makes no sense, but unfortunately, it happens a lot. So at this point, we're almost at the end of our time together. I want to thank everybody for listening. You have my contact information, phone and email and so on. If there's anything I can do to help, feel free to contact me. Once again, I want to thank my many friends at Greenlight for the opportunity to conduct this webinar. And Eddie, I'm happy to stick around maybe for a few extra minutes because we got started late because of the technical problems, but we can cut it off whenever you think is appropriate. So, Eddie, at this point, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, yeah, if you have a few minutes, maybe we can do that. Before we jump into the QA, I have one quick request for the audience. Every year we put our State of MedTech report together. We're working on the 2025 report, and we'd love to hear your experiences. So there should be a link flying across your screen as we speak. Feel free to check that out later. We'd love to hear your insights. So that will be there. Hopefully it's not too distracting, but click that and go look at that later. For now, I have a question that I thought was a good one. It's from Anush, if I'm saying your name correctly. Once the PCCP is approved, do we need any additional documentation to be done before implementing the changes?
Good question. And that's, if I ever do a more advanced version of this webinar, this ties into the whole quality management system that I alluded to at the tail end of our discussion. The short answer to your Anish's question is probably yes, because there's probably going to be some documents that are required on the quality side as part of your QMS that are not necessarily required on the regulatory side. And as a result, they would not be part of your submission to the FDA. So I think the short answer to that question is yes. And this is why, another reason why, if you're considering using PCCPs now or in the future, you really should start thinking about how to include that in your quality management system, because as at the moment, and correct me if I'm wrong, Ian, but I don't think I am, there's nothing in the current QSR that even speaks indirectly to the concept of a PCCP. Yes, there is a defined change management section of the QSR, but not the idea of getting these changes approved in advance, so to speak, before you implement them.
Yeah, I would agree with what you're saying. And there were some comments about this is still just a guidance or a draft guidance, isn't this, for physical products? So I think a lot of people don't realize the actual CFR has been updated with the PCCP terminology, which I think you alluded to.
Correct, and I know I went quick, but there's actually two guidances that it's on one of the earlier slides. The one guidance that focuses specifically on software devices, and then the other subsequent more broad guidance that includes all regulated medical devices across the board, whether it's software or something else. It's an interesting comparison between the two guidances. To use a regulatory pun, Eddie, and I would say that the two guidances are for the most part, substantially equivalent. But anyway.
Okay. So this is the highest voted. I know you already answered this one. If part of a 510K will be PCCP, will be part of the public 510K summary document. I wonder if you could, maybe we could go one layer deeper and talk about what, you showed some examples. What exactly will be included in this PCP? Does it feel like it's revealing too much any more than a 510K itself would reveal?
Yeah, good question. So I would answer that question this way. Deciding what becomes publicly available as part of your 510K, the logic, the process that you use to do that is exactly the same as deciding what would be publicly available from a successful PCCP. In other words, your 510K is oftentimes hundreds, sometimes thousands of pages of long, depending on the device. Clearly, not all of that information becomes publicly available. Some sections of it will, some will not. The same applies to the PCCP. Now, the advantage or disadvantage, depending on how people look at it, is there is no template yet from the FDA on what a PCCP should look like. I prefer that there is no template, because that way it gives me the creativity as an engineer to design that PCCP the way I want to. But I also can design it in such a way where certain portions of it would be publicly available and certain portions of it would not be publicly available. So it's exactly the same as, the stuff that you put in your 510K summary. That by definition will become publicly available. Other parts of your 510K will not be. And there's an option. I don't know how this is going to happen in the PCCP world either, Edian, but if you don't want to make your 510K summary available, you can issue a 510K statement. I don't want to get into the differences between a summary and a statement, but suffice it to say, in regulatory terms, there's a huge difference between a summary and a statement. Right now, I don't know of a corollary to a 510K statement in the PCCP world. So that might be an option in the future. Again, we're getting into sort of some regulatory weeds, but hopefully that makes sense.
Okay. Well, I would go a few minutes over, but I think our platform is going to cut us off at this point. So I'm going to go ahead and tell everybody, thank you so much for coming. Mike, thank you so much for the informative presentation, all your valuable insights. And as a reminder, we will be sending out today's recording and presentation slides later for the webinar. So keep an eye out for that in your email. Also, we will be providing all the Q&A to Mike. So if he's able to get to any of those, I don't know, he's a very busy guy, but perhaps he could get to those. He has that option as well. We'll be forwarding those on to him as well. So on behalf of Greenlight Guru, thank you all for attending. Have a great rest of your day.
Bye-bye.
If you hit that button on the bottom right button, there should be a red button that says leave stage if you want to hit that.